The turkeys arrived on the morning of the county fair like a river of bronze and black, a flowing, gobbling tide of impossibility. 200 of them, gleaming in the dawn light, poured from Elspeth's barn and spilled across the parched yard. They were not the scrawny, desperate creatures of memory, but titans, their chests broad, their tail fans magnificent, their wattles the color of bright blood. The town of promise, which had spent the better part of a year laughing at her, fell silent. Men on their way to the fairgrounds with their own thin cattle and dusty, blighted corn stopped their wagons. Women paused on their porches, wiping their hands on their aprons. The sound was the only thing that moved in the dry air, a deep, rolling chorus of gobbles that sounded less like poultry and more like the judgment of some strange, feathered god. Elspeth stood in the center of the flock, a still point in the feathered chaos, a bucket of cracked corn in her hand. She was not smiling. Her face was calm, her expression as steady as it had been the day she'd made her fool's bargain. She simply watched them and, in turn, watched the town watch her. It had all started 8 months earlier, 2 weeks before the first hard frost, with an act of what Promise unanimously called certified madness. The occasion was the sorrowful auction of the Miller farm, a family defeated by bad luck and worse soil. Elspeth stood at the back of the sparse crowd, a solitary figure in a worn but clean dress, her hands clasped before her. She had come into a small inheritance after her husband's passing, a sum just large enough to buy the scrubby, forgotten parcel of land at the edge of town, and not much else. She was a woman alone, which, in the town's eyes, was a state of perpetual vulnerability, a problem to be solved by either pity or predation. On that day, the town's pity was thick in the air. The miller's bony cows went for a pittance, their rust-pitted plow sold for less, and then the auctioneer, a man with a voice like gravel, gestured to the last lot. And now, folks, the turkeys. A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. There were 200 of them, a late-hatch flock of poults, all legs and necks and frantic, foolish energy. They were too young to have been fattened for Thanksgiving, too frail to likely survive a hard winter without expensive feed and a heated barn, neither of which the Millers had possessed. They were, in short, a bad bet, a walking loss, muttered Mr. Gable from the hardware store, loud enough for all to hear. "What'll we start for this flock of feathered regrets?" the auctioneer asked, his tone laced with wry resignation. Silence. No one wanted them. No one could afford to feed 200 useless birds through the snows. They would eat more in corn than they'd ever be worth in meat. Mr. Sterling, the owner of the grain elevator and the wealthiest man in town, watched with a smirk. He saw them as a final, fitting symbol of the miller's failure. It was then that Elspeth's voice, clear and steady, cut through the quiet. "I'll bid $10 for the lot." A collective turn of heads. $10 was nothing, but it was also something, and it came from the one person they least expected. Mr. Gable looked at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. Sterling's smirk widened into a condescending smile. $10 from the widow," the auctioneer said, his eyebrows raised. "Do I hear 11? $10 for 200 headaches?" The silence returned, heavier this time, thick with judgment. Elspeth stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the birds. She was doing the arithmetic in her head, the desperate, hopeful math that had kept her awake for nights. It was a wild gamble, but it was the only one she had. "Sold," the auctioneer finally sighed, banging his gavel with a thud of finality. "To Mrs. Elspeth Dunn, for $10. The walk home was a public spectacle. Herding 200 half-grown turkeys the 2 miles to her farm was a chaotic, shambling parade of foolishness. The birds scattered and regrouped, darting into yards, pecking at wagon wheels and filling the street with their shrill, panicked cries. Children ran alongside, laughing and shouting. Their parents watched from doorways, shaking their heads. "A woman alone has no business with that kind of trouble," Gable called out to a neighbor, though he meant for Elspeth to hear. She heard. She kept walking, her face set, her eyes on the dusty road ahead. Her farm was little more than a patched-up cabin and a dilapidated barn on 30 acres of what everyone called locust land, notoriously poor soil that seemed to sprout more grasshoppers than grass. By the time she finally managed to haze the entire flock into the barn's dusty interior, dusk was falling and a cold wind was rising from the north, carrying the scent of snow. She was exhausted. Her hands were raw, and the full weight of the town's scorn pressed down on her. She slid the heavy barn door shut, leaned against it in the sudden musky dark, and for the first time allowed a tremor of doubt to shake her. One person alone. It was not a judgment, it was a fact, and she had just spent the last of her money on 200 mouths that would surely starve before the spring thaw. The next morning, as a thin sheet of ice glazed the water trough, she had a visitor. It was not one of the pitying townswomen with a pot of thin soup, nor was it Mr. Sterling coming to offer her pennies on the dollar for her mistake. It was Mrs. Vogel, an old woman who lived on the far side of the county, a German immigrant who kept to herself and was rumored to know things about the land that others had forgotten. She carried a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She did not waste time on pleasantries. Her eyes, pale and sharp, took in Elspeth, the barn, and the anxious birds huddled within. They laughed, Mrs. Vogel said. It was a statement, not a question. Her voice was thick with an accent, like dark soil. Elspeth nodded, saying nothing. The old woman walked to the barn door and peered inside. She watched the turkeys for a long time, her head tilted. The townsfolk saw a flock of liabilities. Mrs. Vogel saw something else. "God does not make a worthless thing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He only makes things whose worth you have not yet learned to see." She unwrapped her bundle. Inside was a loaf of dense, dark bread and a small jar of what looked like seeds. "They are birds of the forest, not the field," she explained, gesturing to the turkeys. "Grain will keep them alive, but it will not make them strong. They need what the woods give." She told Elspeth about pine. The needles, she said, were full of winter life. Chopped fine, they would guard against sickness and grit. They needed sand and tiny pebbles in their gizzards to grind their food. Her land, so poor for corn, was rich in sand and scrub pine. Mrs. Vogel's visit was a balm and a blueprint. It did not solve the immediate problem of feed, but it gave Elspeth something more valuable, a different way of seeing. That night, by the light of a single candle, Elspeth began the patient work. She did not have money for Mr. Sterling's corn, so she would have to make do with what she had. She took an axe to the dense stands of scrub pine at the back of her property. Day after day, she hauled the boughs to the barn, the sharp, clean scent a stark contrast to the growing musk of the flock. She would spend hours with a heavy knife, chopping the needles into a fine, fragrant mash, which she mixed with the last of her own cracked oats. At first, the turkeys were suspicious. They were bred for grain, for the easy life of a farm trough. But hunger is a great teacher. And soon they began to peck at the strange green mixture. She hauled buckets of sand from the dry creek bed, spreading it in a corner of the barn. She sealed every crack in the barn walls with a mixture of mud and straw, fighting the relentless drafts that whispered of the killing cold to come. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and hard as bark. She rose before the sun and fell into bed long after dark, too tired to feel the loneliness of her small cabin. The town, for its part, watched and waited for her inevitable failure. They saw the smoke from her chimney, saw her hauling water from the well, and concluded she was merely prolonging the misery. "She'll be begging for help by Christmas," Mr. Gable declared at the store. "Sterling will get those birds for the price of the plucking." But Elspeth asked for nothing. She worked. It was during that first hard month that the boy appeared. His name was Leo, a thin, quiet child of about 12, who was always at the edges of things, never in the center. He started by simply watching from the fence line, his eyes wide with a curiosity that held no mockery. He was fascinated by the sheer number of the birds, by the strange, constant industry of the woman who cared for them. One day, Elspeth looked up from her chopping to see him standing by the barn door, holding out a bucket. "Water's low at the well," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thought you could use a hand." Elspeth paused, studying his face. She saw no pity there, only a plain desire to be useful. She nodded. From then on, Leo was a silent fixture at the farm. He hauled water, helped chop the pine, spread fresh straw. He never asked for pay. His reward was being there, inside the strange, fragrant world of the barn. It was he who started naming them. The largest Tom, a magnificent bird with a proud strut, he called the general. Another, with a peculiar limp, was named Silas. Soon he had names for dozens of them, giving them identities beyond their place in the flock. He was learning their language, the subtle shifts in their calls that signaled contentment or alarm. And Elspeth, in her quiet way, was learning too. She saw that the turkeys were not foolish but cautious. They were not dirty but meticulous in their dust baths. She noticed the pine mash was working. Their feathers, once dull, were taking on an iridescent sheen. They were growing, filling out, their scrawny frames becoming solid with muscle. She was keeping a secret, like a coal banked low under ash. Her birds were not just surviving, they were thriving. The first blizzard hit in mid-January, a wall of white that buried the world for 3 days. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the temperature dropped so low, the very timbers of the cabin groaned. Elspeth knew the barn, even with its patched walls, would not be enough. She moved into it. For 2 nights and 3 days, she lived with her flock. She built a small, carefully shielded fire in a metal basin in the center of the floor, the smoke curling up to find a crack in the roof. The turkeys, sensing the shared purpose, huddled around the warmth in a dense, living blanket. She dozed in short bursts, her back against a hay bale, the low, contented purr of the flock a constant lullaby. It was an ordeal that should have broken her, but instead, it forged a deeper bond. She was no longer just their keeper. She was part of the flock's warmth, a fellow creature weathering the storm. When the blizzard finally broke and a weak sun emerged, she took account. She had not lost a single bird. It was a private miracle. A week later, she found the first egg. It was hidden in a deep nest of straw, larger than any chicken egg she had ever seen. Its shell a creamy white speckled with brown. It was heavy in her hand, a dense, solid promise. Soon there were more. Not enough to sell, not yet, but enough for her and Leo. She took one of the first to Mrs. Vogel as a gift. The old woman held it up to the light, her face unreadable. Then she cracked it into a hot skillet. The yolk was not yellow, but a deep, fiery orange, the color of a winter sunset. It sizzled in the pan, its aroma rich and wild. "From the pine," Mrs. Vogel said, a slow smile spreading across her face. She slid the cooked egg onto a plate and handed it to Elspeth. "This is not a worthless thing." Elspeth ate, and the taste was of the forest, of resilience, of a secret kept and a truth discovered. It was the taste of survival. As the last of the snows melted and the land turned from brown to a pale, hopeful green, the town's narrative about Elspeth began to shift. The expectation of her failure had been replaced by a grudging, baffled curiosity. Her flock had survived the winter. Through the gaps in the barn boards, they could see the birds were not just alive, but large and vigorous. The laughter had died down, replaced by murmurs. Must have had money tucked away for Sterling's grain after all, Gable surmised, unwilling to imagine any other explanation. Just wait, another man said. Spring is when the sickness comes. She'll lose half of them by May. It was Mr. Sterling himself who came to test the waters. He rode his handsome bay horse right up to her cabin one afternoon, dismounting with the easy confidence of a man who owned most of what he saw. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Well, Mrs. Dunn," he began, his voice smooth with false warmth, "I see you've managed to keep your little hobby alive through the winter. Quite the surprise." Elspeth stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She met his condescending gaze with her own steady one, and waited. "I imagine you're tired of the effort," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the barn. "A woman alone can't be expected to manage a flock this size. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer. Take them all off your hands. Get you some cash before the summer heat brings the cholera." He named a price. It was insultingly low, barely more than what she'd paid for them as half-starved poults. He expected her to be grateful, to see him as her rescuer. But Elspeth had spent the winter doing her arithmetic. She knew the weight of her birds. She knew the value of the eggs in her cellar. She knew the cost of her own labor, written in the calluses on her hands. "They're not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Not yet." His smile tightened at the edges. He was not used to being refused, especially by someone he considered insignificant. "Don't be a fool, woman," he said, his tone hardening. "You'll run out of feed money soon enough. My offer won't stand forever." He swung himself back onto his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the certainty that he had planted a seed of fear. He was partly right. The pine needles that had sustained the flock through the winter were not enough for them now. They needed more as they grew. She needed grain, and that meant she needed money. The answer to her problem arrived a week later, on the back of a broken wagon wheel. A traveling cook, a stout, cheerful man on his way to the capital city, found himself stranded when his wagon hit a rut on the road bordering her farm. He was a man accustomed to the finest ingredients, and his face was a mask of despair as he contemplated a cold supper of hardtack. Seeing his plight, Elspeth offered him a meal. She had little to share but what her farm provided. She brought him into her clean, sparse cabin and set a plate of scrambled turkey eggs and a slice of Mrs. Vogel's dark bread before him. The cook, whose name was Henri, ate politely at first, then with growing astonishment. He put down his fork and stared at the plate. "Madame," he said, his voice full of a chef's reverence, "what is this?" "Turkey eggs," Elspeth replied simply. No, he insisted, taking another bite. This is sunshine. This is the forest. The richness, the flavor. I have served eggs to governors, and I have never tasted the like." Before he left the next morning, his wheel repaired with Leo's help, he insisted on buying every egg she could spare. He paid her in silver, a city price that felt like a fortune. He pressed a card into her hand. "If you ever have birds to sell," he said, his eyes gleaming, "birds raised on whatever magic you are feeding them, you will let me know. The restaurants in the city will fight over them." The silver coins in her hand were cool and heavy. It was more than enough for grain. It was the first external proof that Mrs. Vogel was right. She had something of worth, a worth the town of Promise had not yet learned to see. With the cook's money, she could finally buy proper feed. But she also began to let the flock out of the barn to forage in the pastures during the day. And it was then she discovered the turkey's second secret. Her land was scorned because every few summers it was consumed by grasshoppers. The soil chemistry, the types of native grasses, something about the place bred them in terrifying numbers. Already the ground was alive with their tiny emerging nymphs. Other farmers dreaded them. Elspeth's turkeys saw a feast. They did not graze aimlessly like cattle. They moved with a purpose, a sweeping, methodical army of pest control. They spent their days devouring the grasshoppers by the thousand, growing fat and strong on a protein-rich diet that cost Elspeth nothing. Her pastures, instead of being eaten down to the nub, were protected. Her small vegetable garden, which she had planted with a prayer, was untouched. The turkeys formed a living, gobbling perimeter that no insect could cross. As May turned to a hot, dry June, a quiet anxiety settled over the county. The rains, which should have come in gentle, steady showers, did not arrive. The sky remained a hard, pale, unforgiving blue. The creeks began to shrink, leaving muddy banks exposed to the sun. Mrs. Vogel, squinting at the horizon, shook her head. "The land is thirsty," she said to Elspeth, "and a thirsty land grows angry." By July, the anxiety had turned to open fear. The drought had its teeth in the land. Corn stalks in the fields around, Promise yellowed and stunted. Pastures turned the color of straw. The heat was relentless, a physical weight that shimmered over the baked earth. And then the locusts came. They rose from the parched ground, not in the small swarms of grasshoppers Elspeth's turkeys had been containing, but in a biblical plague, a buzzing, devouring cloud that blotted out the sun. They swept across the county, and what the drought had not killed, they consumed. Fields of corn were stripped to bare stalks in a single afternoon. Mr. Gable's prize-winning vegetable garden, the pride of the town, was gone in an hour. The sound of their chewing was a dry, constant whisper of ruin. Panic took hold. The harvest was gone. There would be no grain to store for winter, no hay for the livestock. Mr. Sterling, who had silos full of last year's grain, became the most powerful man in the county overnight. He doubled his prices, then tripled them. He was not selling feed, he was selling survival, and he charged accordingly. But the plague that descended on Promise skirted Elspeth's farm. The cloud of locusts, drawn to the lush, irrigated fields of her neighbors, saw her 30 acres as a place of danger. For months, her flock of 200 turkeys had been relentlessly hunting, creating a zone of depletion around her property. They were a standing army, and the locusts seemed to sense it. While the farms around her turned to a brown, chewed-up wasteland, Elspeth's land remained a small, defiant patch of green. Her turkeys, feasting on the endless supply of insects at the borders of her property, grew even larger and healthier. The great fortune inversion was complete. The thing everyone had mocked her for, the foolish flock of winter turkeys, had become the one thing that saved her. The town could no longer ignore it. The sight of her green fields in the midst of their brown ruin was a daily testament to their folly and her strange wisdom. The murmurs of mockery were long gone, replaced by a stunned, envious silence. That silence was broken by desperation. The first to come was Mr. Gable. He approached her gate one evening, his shoulders slumped, his usual bluster gone. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. He had been her most vocal critic, the leader of the chorus of laughter. Now his face was etched with the shame of a proud man forced to ask for help. Mrs. Dunn, he started, his voice rough. He couldn't meet her eyes. My wife, the children, we have no meat. My cow is dry and thin. I can't afford Sterling's prices for corn to keep her going, let alone buy flour. He finally looked up, and in his eyes Elspeth saw not the town bully, but a frightened father. I was wondering, he stammered, if I might buy one of your turkeys. Here was her moment of triumph. She could have named any price. She could have charged him double what the bird was worth, exacting a small revenge for the months of humiliation. She could have reminded him of his own words, a walking loss. She looked at his worn-out boots, at the worry lines creasing his face, and she did the arithmetic of a different kind. Not of profit and loss, but of community and grace. The price will be $3, she said, her voice even. It is a fair price. It is the same price I will ask from everyone at the county fair. Gable stared at her, dumbfounded. $3 was more than reasonable. It was generous. He had come expecting to be gouged or turned away. He was being met with dignity. Thank you, he whispered, his pride shattered and rebuilt in a single moment. He paid her, and she and Leo separated a fine, heavy hen from the flock for him. He carried it home, and the word of her fairness spread through the hungry town faster than the locusts had. Others came. A young mother whose children were sick of corn mush. An old farmer whose chickens had stopped laying. To each she gave the same answer. A fair price, the same she would ask at the fair. She was not exploiting their misery. She was feeding them. She was binding the town together with a generosity they had never shown her. The morning of the county fair arrived, hot and still. The grounds were a somber affair. The pens held thin, listless animals. The tables meant for prize-winning produce were mostly bare. The mood was one of grim endurance, not celebration. And into this scene of lack, Elspeth and Leo herded their river of abundance. The sight of them stopped everything. The turkeys, nearly 200 strong, were a vision of health and plenty. Their feathers shone with metallic greens and purples in the sun. They strutted and gobbled, a vibrant, noisy spectacle of life in a landscape of want. They were not just livestock. They were a symbol of what could be, of a wisdom the town had failed to recognize. Mr. Sterling saw their arrival not with wonder, but with avarice. He saw a monopoly he had to control. He strode over, positioning himself between Elspeth and the growing crowd of onlookers, his voice booming for all to hear. Mrs. Dunn, a fine spectacle, a novelty, but they're just birds after all. I'll make you a generous offer, a lump sum for the entire flock. Take the guesswork out of it for you. He named a figure that, while large, was still far below their collective worth. He was trying to use public pressure, the authority of his position, to bully her into a bad deal. He wanted to buy her triumph cheap and sell it dear to the desperate townspeople. Elspeth stood calmly, letting him finish. The whole town was watching, waiting to see what the quiet woman would do. She didn't look at the money in his implied offer. She looked directly at his face. That's a very specific number, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. It's almost as if you've had them counted. Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I'm a good judge of livestock, that's all. Are you? She pressed, relentless but calm. Because I never told anyone the exact number of birds that survived the winter. Not Mr. Gable. Not even Leo here knew for sure until this morning. So I have to ask myself, how did you know my count? A murmur went through the crowd. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Sterling's face flushed. He had overplayed his hand. It was clear to everyone he had sent someone to spy. to count her assets like a predator sizing up its prey. His attempt to look like a generous patriarch was exposed as the greedy scheming it was. He was left speechless, his arrogance punctured. At that moment, a man with a blue ribbon on his lapel stepped forward. It was the fair judge, a state official from the capital. He had been watching the entire exchange. He walked through the flock, examining the birds with an expert eye. He then turned not to Sterling but to Elspeth. "Madam," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "in a year of blight and hardship, you have brought forth abundance. The grand prize this year is not for the fattest pig or the largest pumpkin. It is for the most significant contribution to the security and prosperity of this county. And that prize goes to you." He pinned the large purple ribbon to her dress. A scattered applause started, then grew into a genuine roar. It was an ovation not just for the turkeys, but for her quiet stubbornness, her strange wisdom, her ultimate victory. She accepted the ribbon with a simple nod. Then she turned to the crowd of her neighbors. "The price," she announced, her voice steady and clear, "is $3 a bird for anyone who needs one." The vindication was not in the prize or in the public shaming of Mr. Sterling. It was in the line that formed before her, a line of her neighbors, their faces full of respect and gratitude. It was in the clink of coins as she sold every last bird, but the dozen she would keep for a breeding flock. It was in knowing she was sending her neighbors home with food, not with a lesson in humility, but with a full plate. That evening, the town of Promise was filled with the smell of roasting turkey. It was the smell of a feast, the smell of a community saved from the brink. Elspeth was no longer the town eccentric, the foolish widow. She was the woman who saw value where no one else had, the woman who had fed them. She had earned her place not by conforming, but by remaining true to her own quiet vision. She used the money from the fair wisely. The next spring, she bought high-quality seed grain and sold it to her neighbors at a fair price, breaking Mr. Sterling's monopoly for good. She taught Leo how to manage the new, smaller flock of turkeys, which were now prized not only for their meat and eggs, but as the county's best defense against the locusts. He was no longer a boy on the edges of things, but a young man with purpose and skill. Her farm became a place of learning, a green and thriving testament to patience. One cool autumn evening, a year after her great gamble, she sat on the porch with Mrs. Vogel, watching the new generation of turkeys strut across the yard. They were magnificent, the descendants of the feathered regrets she had bought for $10. Mrs. Vogel nodded slowly, a deep satisfaction in her eyes. "You see," she said, her voice the same as it had been on that first cold morning, "God does not make a worthless thing." Elspeth looked out over her land, at the sturdy barn and the healthy flock, at the fields that were ready for a new planting. She thought of the journey from scorn to respect, from loneliness to belonging. She had learned to see the worth in a flock of forgotten birds, and in doing so, she had taught a whole town to see the worth in a quiet woman, alone, who refused to believe in worthless things. The air was cool, and it carried the promise of a gentle winter, a winter not of survival, but of peace.